Okay. So have you ever wondered if, like, thoughts and prayers actually have any, like, real power?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, a lot of people wonder about that.
Well, you sent over this super interesting article called Spirituality on Steroids.
Uh-huh.
It's by Dorian Scott Cole, and it tackles this whole question head on, like from both the scientific and the spiritual side.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I think you're going to find it really interesting.
Yeah, sounds fascinating.
So the author kind of kicks things off, by pointing out this like deep yearning, especially among younger generations.
Okay.
For a more like tangible spirituality.
Makes sense. They're not just content with blind faith anymore.
Right, like they want proof. They want to see evidence that like their thoughts and prayers actually make a difference in the world.
Totally. It's like they want their spirituality to have teeth, something they can really sink their teeth into, not just like abstract concepts and stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, and the author just dives right into it,
Yep.
claiming that, thoughts and prayers do work, but then throws in this, but it's complicated, which of course makes things even more interesting. And then they really start digging into this whole concept of a spiritual world,
Right.
arguing that if such a realm exists, then like prayer suddenly starts to make a lot more sense.
So basically the author is saying that like the foundation for their argument is that there's something more out there.
Yeah.
Beyond what we can see and touch and all that.
Precisely. And they bring up some pretty compelling evidence to back this up. For instance, they talk about near-death experiences.
Oh yeah, NDs.
Exactly. Where people report these like remarkably similar experiences. Some even claiming to have witnessed events in the physical world while they were like clinically dead. It's really hard to explain that stuff away with just like purely scientific explanations.
Right, so you're saying there's at least a possibility that like something beyond the physical realm is influencing these experiences.
That's the idea the author's exploring. And they also talk about remote viewing,
Okay.
which, believe it or not, has been actually studied by the CIA.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some individuals were able to accurately describe like locations they had never physically visited, sometimes with accuracy rates as high as 95%. And here's the kicker, the accuracy actually increases when like multiple viewers collaborate.
Wow, that's crazy. Like imagine the possibilities if we could actually harness that kind of power.
Right. It really makes you think.
It does.
And to further support their argument, they bring up the Noetic Institute. You familiar with that?
I've heard of it.
It was founded by astronaut Edgar Mitchell.
Right.
And this institute is dedicated to like the scientific study of paranormal phenomena. They've produced some really interesting research that kind of points toward the existence of a spiritual dimension.
So we're starting to see like a picture emerge here. But how do we go from like evidence of a spiritual world to like proving that prayer is effective? I mean, is it even possible to study something like that
Well,
scientifically?
That's the challenge, isn't it? The author acknowledges that while it's definitely possible, it's incredibly difficult. There's so much potential for bias and confounding factors to really muddy the waters. Like, for example, confirmation bias
Right.
can be a major issue. Researchers who already believe in the power of prayer, they might unconsciously design their studies or interpret the data in a way that favors their pre-existing beliefs.
Isn't that kind of a problem with like all L research though? Not just when studying spirituality. I mean, we all have biases. Right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a human tendency, and one we have to be very, very mindful of, especially in scientific research. And then there's the replication crisis, that's been plaguing fields like psychology and sociology and even medicine.
Right.
Studies have shown that a significant percentage of published research, sometimes as high as 64%, fails to replicate,
Oh, wow.
which raises serious questions about the reliability of some of the prayer studies out there.
So like how do researchers even begin to unravel all of these complexities when dealing with something as like intangible as prayer? What are like some of the specific obstacles they face?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is just like defining and measuring the desired outcome of prayer. What are we even looking for? Is it like a specific physical healing, a change in someone's emotional state, a shift in circumstances? If the desired outcome is vague, it becomes nearly impossible to isolate the actual impact of the prayer.
It's like trying to pin down a ghost or something.
Exactly. And then there's the whole theological debate about whether studying prayer outcomes is even like ethically permissible. Some people believe that doing so is basically like testing God,
Right.
which they view as disrespectful.
Right. That definitely adds another layer of complexity. And of course, we can't forget about the placebo effect. How do researchers like tease apart the power of positive thinking from the power of prayer itself?
It's a huge challenge. It's entirely possible that just the positive expectations associated with prayer, rather than some kind of divine intervention, could be responsible for any observed effects.
So are we basically saying that it's like almost impossible to study prayer definitively?
Not necessarily. The author does bring up this really interesting idea that prayer might be more effective in influencing biological processes,
Oh,
like healing from an illness, than it is in altering fixed events.
so you mean like prayer might work more on the level of biology rather than like defying the laws of physics?
That's one way to interpret it. It aligns with the idea that prayer could be tapping into some kind of spiritual energy that interacts with our physical bodies.
But that still leaves the question of why so many people feel like their prayers go unanswered. How does the article address that?
Well, the author reminds us that, statistically speaking, most of our worries tend to resolve themselves naturally anyway. Remember, research suggests that only about 8% of the things we worry about actually come to pass. So that makes it extremely difficult to determine if a positive outcome is really due to prayer or just the odds playing out in our favor.
So we might be mistaking coincidence for divine intervention.
That's a possibility the author explores. They actually use a great analogy. Just because the sun rises every morning and daytime follows doesn't mean that the sun causes daytime.
Right.
We know it's the Earth's rotation that's responsible for both. Similarly, just because someone prays for something and it happens doesn't automatically mean that the prayer caused it. There could be tons of other factors at play.
It's like that classic correlation versus causation dilemma that seems to trip people up all the time, even in scientific research. But hold on a second, the author doesn't just throw their hands up and say that prayer is impossible to study.
Right.
They actually highlight some pretty compelling studies that show a positive effect.
That's right. They discuss several really well-designed studies that suggest prayer might actually have a measurable impact. One really interesting example is a study conducted by the Noetic Institute using chocolate.
They blessed chocolate.
I know it sounds a little strange, but they found that chocolate that had been blessed with positive intentions actually had a more positive effect on people's moods than the exact same chocolate that hadn't been blessed.
So our thoughts and intentions might have a tangible impact on the physical world. That's mind-blowing.
It really is. And the author points to another intriguing study, this one from South Korea, that examined the impact of prayer on infertility. Women undergoing in vitro fertilization were randomly assigned to either a prayer group or a control group. The women in the prayer group had nearly double the pregnancy rate compared to the control group, and the odds of this happening by pure chance were incredibly low, something like 13 out of 10,000.
Wow, those are some pretty impressive results. But couldn't skeptics argue that there were flaws in the study design or other factors that might have influenced the outcome?
Of course, that's always a possibility. And to try and address that, the author brings up another study that used bush babies.
Bush babies?
Yeah, to examine the impact of prayer on wound healing. Because animals are less susceptible to the placebo effect, it kind of helps strengthen the findings. In this study, the animals that were prayed for showed significantly faster healing rates than those in the control group.
So using animals in research like this helps rule out the possibility that it's just the power of suggestion at work.
Exactly. However, it's important to remember that not all studies on prayer have had positive results. For instance, the author mentions that studies on cardiology patients haven't generally shown any significant effects.
So it seems like the research on prayer is kind of a mixed bag.
That's right, and the author's very upfront about that. They personally believe that there is a spiritual world and that prayer does work, but they acknowledge that the scientific evidence is still inconclusive.
So where does that leave us? We have some evidence suggesting that a spiritual realm might exist, but the effectiveness of prayer seems to be a bit of a gray area. What's the author's final takeaway?
Well, from here, the author kind of shifts gears a bit and discusses the implications of all this for the church. They argue that churches need to find new and engaging ways to connect with younger generations who are increasingly skeptical of traditional religious practices.
So the author's acknowledging this generational shift in how people approach spirituality.
Exactly. They even mention a course they developed specifically for church leaders on how to bridge this gap and connect with those who are seeking a more evidence-based spirituality.
And it sounds like this course is resonating with people. The author mentions it has a 4.5-star rating, which suggests it's providing some valuable insights.
It seems to be. The author really appears to be advocating for a more balanced approach to spirituality, one that blends personal faith with a willingness to engage with scientific inquiry.
It's like they're encouraging a dialogue between the heart and the mind. embracing both the wonder of the unseen world and the rigor of scientific exploration. That's a fascinating perspective, and I'm sure we'll have even more to unpack in part 2. But for now, we'll leave you with that thought to ponder.
Yeah, it's a really unique approach, isn't it? Kind of reminds me of those last couple sections in the article, the ones about probability space and potential space. It's like the author's asking us to open up our minds about what's actually possible, to think about how our own spiritual experiences, even the ones that seem totally unexplainable, could actually fit into some bigger framework.
So it's like they're challenging us to not shy away from the big questions, but to really try to deepen our understanding of this whole spiritual realm.
Exactly. It's about being curious and discerning, not just blindly accepting things, but really using our critical thinking skills, questioning assumptions, and exploring all these different perspectives, and being open to the idea that there's still so much we don't know.
Speaking of exploring, I got to go back to that chocolate study for a sec. It really got me thinking, what are the deeper implications of that? What does it say about intention and its impact on the physical world?
It's a wild one, isn't it? If intention can influence something as basic as chocolate, it makes you wonder about a lot of things. Could our thoughts, our prayers, our intentions even be a form of energy that interacts with the world around us in ways we're only starting to grasp?
It's like we're just dipping our toes into a whole new realm of possibilities, almost like there's this hidden dimension of reality that we haven't fully tapped into yet.
I like that. And remember that South Korean study on infertility we talked about? The one where prayer seemed to have a huge impact on the pregnancy rate? That one really stretches the boundaries of what we typically think is possible.
But couldn't people argue that those results were just by chance? Or due to something else we don't understand? Correlation doesn't automatically equal causation, right?
That's a good point. And the author acknowledges that we should always consider other explanations. But think about it. The chances of those results happening randomly were incredibly small. 13 out of 10,000. That's a pretty powerful statistic.
It almost seems like there's some unseen force tipping the scales. Working in favor of those who are being prayed for.
And that's where the Bush baby study comes in. By using animals, they could minimize the placebo effect, which makes the argument that it wasn't just positive thinking a lot stronger.
Right. Using animals helps rule out that it's all just the power of suggestion.
Exactly. So those 3 studies together, the chocolate, the infertility, and the Bush babies, they take a really interesting picture. It seems like the author's making a good case for prayer, even if the scientific evidence isn't totally clear-cut yet. And even when something good happens after we pray, it's important to remember that just because 2 things happen close together doesn't mean one caused the other.
That's a trap it's easy to fall into. Not just with prayer, but in life in general. We see patterns and connections that might not actually be there.
Totally. It's natural to want to understand the world around us, to find explanations. But sometimes the answer is that there just isn't a direct connection.
It's a good reminder to stay humble and remember there's a lot we just don't know. But if the author recognizes all these complexities and limitations, why are they so focused on bridging science and spirituality, especially within the church?
It's a great question. I think it comes down to their strong belief that both knowledge, like what we learn from science and ED faith, what we experience personally, are crucial for a full understanding of the world. It's like they're saying these 2 ways of knowing don't have to clash. They can actually work together and make each other richer.
So it's not about choosing sides, science versus religion, but finding a way to integrate them into a bigger, more complete view of things.
Exactly. And I think that's why that course the author made for church leaders is hitting home with people. It gives them a way to bridge that gap between those who want scientific proof and those who are drawn to faith and spiritual practice.
Like they're saying, we can embrace both the wonder of the unseen A&D, the critical thinking that comes with science, but how do we actually navigate that space between knowledge and faith? What does that look like day to day?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The author suggests we need to be willing to embrace the unknown, to be okay with mystery and not try to force everything into these neat little categories. It's about recognizing that what we know both scientifically and spiritually is always changing.
So it's not about clinging to those rigid beliefs or having to be absolutely certain about everything.
That's it. It's more about cultivating curiosity, being willing to look at things from different angles, and being open to changing our understanding when we learn something new or have a new experience.
Kind of like that Einstein quote.
Yeah.
The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.
Oh, I love that one. And I think it really sums up what the author's getting at. It's all about that journey of discovery, both within ourselves and out in the world.
That's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. It pushes us to face these huge questions about reality, our place in the universe, and the possibility that there's something more out there.
And the author does such a great job of showing how science, indie spirituality can be part of that. It's not about one versus the other, it's recognizing they both give us a different way of looking at things.
And sometimes the most interesting insights come from using multiple lenses, right?
Exactly. It's like those 3D images where you have to kind of unfocus your eyes to see the hidden picture. You need both perspectives for the whole thing to come into view.
So we're being encouraged to embrace this kind of like intellectual A&D spiritual double vision.
I love that. It's about making space for the known A&D, the unknown, the seen A&D, the unseen, the scientific A&D, the spiritual.
It's a beautiful dance, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it seems like the author's inviting us all to join in.
And maybe even learn some new moves along the way.
Well, Deep Divers, this has been a seriously thought-provoking journey into prayer, spirituality, and that intersection of faith and science. As we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final thought inspired by the author.
Think about it. How can you blend your own spiritual experiences with what science tells us? How can you stay curious and open to exploring those mysteries of the universe without having to know everything, for sure?
It's a question worth pondering, and we encourage you to keep searching, questioning, and exploring. Until next time, happy diving.